ACMi productions are only made possible with your support. Visit patreon.com/ACMi to learn how you can help.
So we are meeting at the March 12th, 2024 meeting of the Arlington Artificial Turf Study Committee. For the members of the public joining, welcome. I believe this is our 11th or 12th meeting, so we've packed a lot into a short time. We have 2 sets of meeting minutes to approve tonight. I hope everyone had a chance to look at them, and I want to thank Natasha, particularly for the ones where Ian Lacey came and spoke. I thought they were very, very good and very helpful minutes. They sort of were exactly what you want minutes to be, a reference, for the meeting. I had my notes, but your minutes were, far better than anything I was writing. So, so the first of those meetings was, Natasha, help me out.
20th.
Which one?
So February 20th meeting, and then we've got the 27th.
Okay. So the February 20th was the meeting where we had Ian as the guest speaker. Yes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Mike moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Marvin.
Okay, so we'll go right down the list.
Yeah, go down the list.
Mike?
Yes.
Leslie?
Yes.
Okay. Joe Barr, I don't see him yet. Bill?
Yes.
Oops. Natasha is a yes.
Yeah. Video.
Marvin?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Are you guys getting feedback?
A little bit.
Bunch.
Not much.
Okay.
I think if we all mute, that would help.
Yeah, maybe we should try and mute.
Natasha, I think you can mute all of us and then we can unmute.
Okay. Thank you. Because I can't exactly tell who it is. Mutable. Okay, there it is. Okay, everyone should have been muted. And now we'll just continue to ask the public to please stay muted and keep your cameras off. And just the committee here, the 9 folks that are on the Artificial Study Committee, if you can unmute as needed, or if you'd like to just unmute altogether, and then if you can share your video. I know David Morgan cannot, and if anyone else can't, that's fine too. But we will just ask that the members do only. Okay, so
we've got the February 20th minutes for approved. Now we have the February 27th, 2024 minutes. Hope everyone's had a chance to look at them. That was our most recent meeting. Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Marvin moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Leslie seconds. Please call the roll.
Mike?
Yes.
Leslie?
Yes.
Joe Barr? Not here yet. Jill?
Yes.
Natasha? Yes. Marvin?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
All right. Both sets of meeting minutes pass.
Excellent. Well, now on to the business of the meeting. First correspondence received. Natasha, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what we got and who we got it from?
Sure. So we received quite a bit of response last week. I apologize. I know the file was very big, and I think I did get an email. I had to condense the packet, so some of the information that was given may have been distorted slightly. I apologize if that happened. It was the only way I could get the packet out. So in terms of correspondence received, we received an email from Beth Malofchik, which cited 2 films. One was South Florida PBS presents We're All Plastic People Now, and the second film was We Are the Guinea Pigs. We received an email from Phil Lasker, and this was a larger document that had information he wanted to submit for the Artificial Turf Committee, which was just submitted on his behalf, and I believe it was over 300 pages, so I was only able to include the first 7 pages, but you did have the link if you wanted to look at additional information. We received an email from Robin Bergman, Microplastics in Every Human Placenta. It was an article. Mike Gildsgame sent us an email with a link to the EPA, a news briefing, basically stating that the EPA is requiring toxic release inventory reporting for 7 additional PFAS. We received, I think, 3 emails from Susan Chapnick. One was a document from Tori about building an organic maintenance program for athletic fields. The second was a study about engineered green infrastructure to reduce 6 ppb quinone in stormwater runoff. And the third was a link to some Massachusetts towns basically passing a referendum on a ban to purchase, or a ban to purchase PFAS containing material. And there was included with that was I think a guidance from, I think it was the city of Newton. So that was all the correspondence received that we got.
Yeah, and I just want to state for anyone listening, for the committee, but anyone also listening from the public, we have received a number of items since Natasha sent out the agenda. So I don't want people to think we don't distribute these things. It's just the cycle we're on. She has to get it before, preferably by Thursday evening, or at the absolute latest, Friday morning before, 9 o'clock. And so if you're not getting it in, then it will be distributed to the committee. It just won't be at that next meeting. So I know we've gotten a few people who weren't perturbed, but we're sort of like, hey, are you not giving my stuff out? Well, we will, all in good time, but those are the deadlines we have to work with. So we already have a number of things that will be included in the next packet that didn't come in time for this past one.
And please do reach out if you think that something hasn't been included. I would not intend to exclude anything, but it could happen. So, there's lots of emails that are coming in. So please reach out if there's something you sent that did not get in.
So now to the business of the meeting. We now are in possession of all the narrative submissions from each of the working groups. So first off, thank you. I'd say, by and large, they're sort of the natural extension of what we received for the bullet points, but that wasn't completely the case, but mostly that was the case. So I hope everyone had a chance to review the other. I mean, you can obviously go and review your own working group, but I'm pretty certain you're familiar with that. I hope you spent some time between our last meeting and or when the packet came out in this meeting, reading what the other groups submitted, because really today's purpose is to, I don't want to say challenge, but to ask if you have questions, or if you want to challenge something that another group said. This is the opportunity, because what Natasha and I are trying to do now, and it's taking longer than we thought. I should have known it would take longer than we thought, but we are trying to take all of these submissions and work them into a comprehensive and cohesive, emphasis on cohesive report. It doesn't sound like it's an anthology. That actually sounds like it's speaking with one voice and one sort of has, as my English teacher in high school would say, has flow. It flows, So that's taking a little longer than we thought. How much longer? Not much longer, but longer than I had originally budgeted. So that's what we're working on. But while we're doing that, we need to be sure that everyone on this committee agrees not just with what their working group said, but what the other working groups are saying. And if they don't agree, ask the hard questions now. And B, and this is really the heart of this meeting, is I'd like to start to see if we have some general consensus about findings and recommendations. Nothing that has to be locked in today, but obviously the next time you get something from us, it will be a draft report that will, if all goes well, incorporate everyone's submissions, that will flow nicely, that will have segues and section headings and citations and all that jazz. but also at the end, we'll potentially start to point in a certain direction of what our findings and recommendations would be to town meeting. And that was part of our charge. You know, we're supposed to be a study committee, but ultimately we are also supposed to make findings and recommendations. So that's a more complicated subject, and we should begin that tonight. But first, I want to just sort of open it up and say, I know we said, you know, we can go health, safety, environmental, but I don't necessarily think we have to be that regimented. I mean, I'd rather say, you know, you've read the other group's narrative sections. What do you think? Do you have questions? Are you comfortable with what they're saying? Are you not comfortable with what they're saying? Doesn't have to be that stark, you know, or do you have questions about it? Are there some things you need clarification on? Because I think now would be the time. Tasha, anything you want to add before we open it up?
No, I think that's perfect. We do have, you know, we can go down the list, or we can just jump into just what you said. So Jim, you just let me know how you want to, do you want to go down the list with health, safety, environmental, or just let the group decide if there's something specific they want to talk about?
I guess maybe I'd rather open it up to the group. I mean, you know, we can, for instance, talk about safety, but if no one wants to talk about the safety report, then I'm not going to force anyone to. And I'm just picking that because that was the one I worked on with Joe and Leslie. But does anyone want to jump in here? And don't be shy, because this is where the rubber hits the road. Meetings like this. Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, as a general comment, to say that I thought that the other two reports that we saw were quite good. And I think that they were nuanced and they were balanced. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. I will say there's one issue that I think came up in all three reports, and that is one of testing. And I think the issue at this point is that things are changing in the area of testing for things like PFAS and other chemicals. And in fact, you know, we looked at what the Arlington High School fields were talking about. And I think that the testing report limits were back in 2019 when that was originally done. But I think that EPA and DP have come out with some new methods for doing testing. So I think the point I'm making here is that we shouldn't be into hard and fast rules about testing various components, because those things are changing. And I think that that's an important thing to note. I think we can say the latest, say from EPA method 1633 or whatever it is one we should have consultants and manufacturers use. But I think we also need to note that things are changing. Methods are changing, technology is changing on how we look at the artificial turf and other components.
I agree with that. I mean, I'd also just make a large jump off from what you said, Mike, which is a good point, and make a larger point. I mean, we can only know what we know now. You know, there are signals from some of these studies of where things might be going, but you know, and I'll take just the example of infills, alternative infills. I mean, there are some promising signs about some of these alternative infills, but I think we'd all agree. You know, there haven't been a lot of extensive studies about these infills, other than industry studies, which, you know, are industry studies. They have a certain slant. Doesn't mean they're not accurate, but they, you know, are not coming at it from a peer-reviewed perspective. So, you know, I think the key in the report is we're very honest with our audience about what we know, what we don't know, what we still have questions on, you know, the gaps analysis, essentially, you know, what, you know, our recommendations or findings are based on a moment in time. And that moment is, you know, spring 2024. And I think generally each group, I think, had a lot of honesty and integrity and showing their hands and not trying to, you know, make comments they couldn't defend. But that's a larger point, I guess, carrying on from where Mike left off.
But I think we do also need to acknowledge, as you say, there is movement and evolution happening. And I'm not sure that nuance is carried throughout. You know, that for example, you know, it was stated that there's no evidence of meaningful recycling, but we've seen and we've heard about that evolution and the evolution of the end of, the end of life practices that are happening. And when Ian was here, he talked about things that are happening. And I'm not sure that we're reflecting that. It seems like we're saying in certain instances that this is the way it is, and that, almost that there's, no hope for any mitigation or evolution. And I'll point to that as the recycling piece to me came across.
I think it's an important point, Leslie. Recycling is something where there's sort of differences of opinion, and some people say we're very far. We've heard perspectives and read perspectives of people saying recycling is happening and can very easily be done. We're hearing other perspectives where it's not happening at all, which I don't think is accurate. I think there is some kind of recycling, but the extent to which, I think we have to be I completely agree with you, Leslie. I think we have to be very honest about recycling, that there are some efforts happening, but it's still very sort of, to what we've read and heard, it's not developed enough where there's
not
unanimity of
industry-wide.
opinion about where this is headed. Yeah.
Though and we've also seen that, some of the requirements of the municipalities that are installing are that contractually they're making that part of. And I think we need to reflect, again, when we talk about mitigation, to things that we see as negatives, contractually requiring this end of life on artificial turf systems is being written into contracts. And we saw that with some of the municipalities. So I think that reflecting some of that would be important to note.
Yeah.
I continue to be concerned about, in particular, the environmental report talked about Springfield and I believe Manchester by the Sea.
Marblehead.
Marblehead. And
Marblehead.
we've had conversations in this group more than once about those not being accurate comparable communities. And Springfield having a turf complex, and I believe Marblehead High School has a turf complex as well.
They do.
And so I think for us that are on the committee, maybe we understand the nuance of that, but I think from someone from the outside reading that report, they're saying, oh, well, Springfield can do no turf, so why can't Arlington? And then I think to really make sure we understand, like, there is a space difference there. And I think we talked about at least Malden being a comparable community in the lack of land space. So if we're going to include examples, we should include some examples that are more realistic to what we're dealing with. So I was concerned about that. And the other piece I was concerned about in the environmental report is I think they had some mitigations along the way, and then the end statement really said Arlington's future fields should be natural turf. And I don't think that aligned with the discussion we've been having all along. I think what Leslie's saying is really looking at recycling, looking at, turf that's constructed in PFAS-free ways was some of the conversations we've had. I think of like the first person Joe brought up in conversation was MIT and their use of both types of fields depending. So I was really shocked to read that report and have it end with that statement based on the conversations we've had. And I wouldn't be comfortable submitting a report with my name on it that ended with that statement based on the conversations we've had along the way.
I 100% support what you're saying, Jill. I had a similar unease with that I'm also very uneasy with the chart that came at the end of that section that has an assumption of organic management in the chart and based some of that comparative of natural turf versus artificial turf with the caveat of organic management. We don't have organic management in town. That may be something that someone is looking toward, but that is not how our fields are currently maintained. And it gave me the impression that we do. And we didn't study organic management of turf fields. That wasn't part of what we were tasked to do. So I don't think that that chart really can or should reflect something that exists currently. And that was the impression I was left with.
Other comments? Mike, I don't know if you want to say anything in response or.
Well, sure. I think that some good points, but I think the task that we were tasked with is to make some recommendations about fields in Arlington. And one of those recommendations is that there should be organic management. I don't believe, or the intent was not to say we're currently doing that, but I think the issue again about recycling comes back to what I was saying about testing. The recycling is evolving. It is perhaps going to be improved. Current recycling involves pyrolysis, which is basically melting down the components of the field. And that's a rather intensive process. But in any case, I think that the points are well taken, but I think that there is, as the report says, there's really no meaningful recycling in the Northeast at this point that I'm aware of. And I'd be glad to learn more about it if it does happen to exist. Regarding the Marblehead and Springfield issues, sure, I think that the size of the town may be an issue. I think you mentioned, and I think that we use those as examples of places where organic or natural turf has been used. But that is certainly something we can discuss and perhaps come to some agreement about.
Well, those two, they may be using organic turf management on their natural turf fields, but I think Jill's point was they also have artificial turf fields. They're
Sure,
not strictly managing their recreational pursuits on natural grass, organically maintained fields.
Sure, neither is Arlington, of course, as we know.
Well, we're not organically managing any of our fields.
Right.
And we heard, and I don't know if I didn't really see it reflected that, the comments about whether, when we had Ian here talking to us about better management practices and natural turf management practices, one of the points that was made was he does not know a municipality that has an adequate budget to maintain fields naturally.
Correct. I think
And
that's
so I think that needs to also come across loud
sure.
and clear, because we're
Yeah.
not doing it. And I don't believe we have the capacity in our current fiscal environment to do it.
Oh, I fully agree with that. And I agreed with Ian when he said that. I think the point that we were trying to make is that whatever the field is needs to be costed out fully. And that would include just a notion or an idea, what would it cost to do a full maintenance, whether you're talking about artificial or natural turf, what are the components of a real good maintenance program and what would that cost. That doesn't mean we're going to end up doing it, but I think that's a bit of information that's important to know.
I don't think that's the way the report is written, though.
Right. That was my point.
I'm going to pause here because I see Joe has his hand up.
Thanks, Jim. And apologies for being late, but also I just want to note how nice it is to see everyone with natural like sunlight coming into the side rather than it being dark out. Anyway, I guess two thoughts. One, sort of on this question about the, what was in the environmental section. I guess one, I think if my opinion is that if the only thing we were considering was environmental impacts, then yes, it is pretty clear that we should do organically managed natural turf fields, right? Like I think the evidence is pretty clear that purely from an environmental perspective, natural turf fields will be better because they certainly have better environmental performance. That said, that's not the only thing we're looking at, right? So I think the goal at this point should be, I think, to try to figure out like, okay, given the health, safety, and and I think the other groups did a really good job of defining health and safety in a very broad way in terms of mental health and sort of how do we make our kids or give our kids the resources they need to be successful, et cetera, et cetera. Given all that, what do we actually think we should do? Not just should we do purely from an environmental perspective. So I think the challenge I think is now to sort of balance those things all together. The other point I'll make, just thinking about it from the fiscal and capital planning perspective, is that as I've said before, we need to be realistic about the fact that we do not have money in our capital budget to pay for our artificial turf fields. So it's going to be either a third-party source, a grant, something like Belmont Hill School, if such an offer ever comes before us. But like we just presented to the Finance Committee last week, and was a harsh awakening for everybody, including the Capital Planning Committee, to remind ourselves just how many really critical like school maintenance projects we're not able to fund. So like in that context, I think I just want to remind everyone that this is sort of there's a reality here about what's feasible from a financial perspective. The other thing though is this is one of many things, and we're trying to tackle this from the Capital Planning Committee's perspective, where there's a trade-off between operating cost and capital cost, right? Because like artificial turf field will cost more to build, but will cost less presumably to maintain life cycle. But unfortunately, we have a capital budget and operating budget, and they don't really connect particularly. So if we save money, if we spend extra money on capital, but to save money on operating, the capital plan doesn't there's no way for the capital plan to recapture that money. The same issue comes up with like energy efficiency retrofits. Like, we save money on the operating cost, but we have to put up the capital up front, and there's not a great way to sort of balance those two off. So I don't have a specific point here, but just to mention that like this is one of many topics where this issue is coming up, where we have difficulty making those trade-offs between capital and operating. So just more for background.
Natasha.
I just wanted to, in the interest sort of time, and I kind of want to get at what I think the crux of the issue is here. I personally read the environmental report, and I read all of the reports, and I felt very much that the safety and the health reports took a very neutral line and sort of discussed both natural and artificial turf in a fair comparison. When I read the environmental report, it felt very much like it was coming from an anti-turf sort of perspective. And so I'm struggling with that piece of it. And I think that might be why there's a lot of conversation about the report. I just want to throw that out there as like, I think that might be what's happening. But second, I do want to draw attention to one piece of the report that I'm absolutely not comfortable with, and I would love to understand more about. I know a lot about the toxic algae blooms that happen here in Arlington, and there's a reference in here about toxic algae blooms and artificial turf, and some sort of a connection being made that the phosphorus or whatever. I don't understand why toxic algae bloom is sort of in the report, because we don't have, that's on page 5 under ecological effects. And my concern there is that the toxic algae blooms that we have had have been at Spy Pond and Menotomy Rocks Park. And all of the information that I have about that leads to it's not, there's no artificial turf in the area. So it's more about pesticide use. It's more about, runoff from whatever is in that area. So I don't understand that piece of it. And I would love to understand more about that so that I can either fully support that piece of it, or not. Cause I'm very perplexed by that. And, that's sort of, I guess, what I'll end with.
So I see David Morgan's hand up, and I know Joe Connolly's trying to get into it, but I'm going to go David and then Joe. David?
Well, I can just speak to the harmful algal bloom question. The removal of nutrients by soil microorganisms and also uptake by vegetation like shrubbery, grass, etc., is what prevents the nutrient loading from happening in waterways. So to put that in much simpler terms, there's a bunch of fertilizer essentially running off from people's lawns, fields, etc. Those enter the water bodies, and the result is that algae has a lot to feed on. And so those blooms occur when there's a whole bunch of fertilizer essentially in the water. So if you take away the opportunity for the removal of those nutrients, i.e., putting an artificial turf field over what is currently grass or maybe other vegetation, you'll get presumably more direct runoff, and there will be no nutrient abatement happening.
But I guess I can't understand that, because we currently don't, you can't make that I feel like, I don't want to berate this here, but I feel like that's really a stretch. And that it's kind of saying two things. One, actually, if you had the artificial turf field down, maybe there wouldn't be an application of pesticides, and that runoff into whatever water body, as opposed to natural grass field where there might be pesticides used because we're not doing organic maintenance. So I think for me, like, I feel like that whole topic should just be removed, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I feel like it's very much two-sided, like it can go both ways. So I don't feel comfortable with that. And it being in conjunction with the artificial turf piece. Like, I don't see the connection. Let me know, like, I don't, the reference that you had there, it wasn't very clear where that was sort of coming from. So
David, I would agree if we were cutting down a forest.
Sorry, Joe. I just want to go on order because I know Joe's
Oh,
been.
sorry.
I'll get back to. I just want to try to. I know you're anyway. We'll get back to Joe Connolly. I know you want to get in.
No, thanks, and I'll be. I mean, not going to repeat what everyone has said. I do. I just have some general concerns. I felt that. Again, this is utmost respect for the environmental committee that I know put a lot of work into it. I just felt the other two were very balanced, and I just didn't feel, and maybe the environmental impacts can't be balanced, but I just felt that it was coming from a very anti-turf perspective. And I understand that might be ultimately where the environmental impacts land. I mean, nothing about the, potentially having the option for PFAS free. Maybe it's there. I didn't see it. I think the line about the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection considering officially classifying artificial turf as impermeable, the fact that they're considering it, I mean, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, I don't know if that really should be in our report. If someone's just considering potentially doing something, I think, again, I don't want to point to industry, but I think they would really take exception with it being classified as impermeable. I believe that's one of the potential greatest benefits of it. And again, I think, I won't go on and on, but the other thing about Tory, I think the note in the reference section, the notes on Tory, I understand it may have been established by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I just, as a independent agency, from my perspective, and you guys know where I'm coming from, I think they're anything but independent. I think they have a job to do, and they're using everything at their means to kind of anti-plastic, anti-turf, and not look at any potential benefits or situations where it may be, may make sense to do. So I'll stop there, but I just have some overall concerns on the balance. Thank you.
Jill and then David Morgan.
So I guess my question for David was, we're realistically not talking about taking forest and making fields. We're talking about taking fields that are fertilized and converting them into potentially, not all of them, into artificial turf. So in that way, Natasha's really right. Like, do we know that taking a field that is not soaking in water anyways very well, and not having to fertilize is any worse than switching out for artificial turf? Because I would agree with the statement, if we're taking a forest and cutting it down, or even shrubbery, like a meadow, and cutting it down and making it into artificial turf. But I don't think there's any evidence that that's true if you're taking a fertilized field and trading for artificial turf, that you're going to increase runoff with the artificial turf. And I think we had a lot of discussion along the way about, if we're using these sites for artificial turf, are there ways to put things in to force the landscape around the area to be more natural? And, put some of these meadows back, or whatever can do some of the capture of carbon and the capture of fertilizer. And I don't think those conversations were reflected in the mitigations that were presented.
David?
So on the question of whether we can demonstrate that artificial turf is sort of better in the sense of abating or minimizing nutrient runoff, I'm not aware of any research that's been done to that effect. What I can say is I've studied aquatic buffers pretty extensively. Like, that was my research at EPA before I came to Arlington, and I can say that it requires quite a lot of area to infiltrate water and to collect nutrients. And there's a simple difference in my mind, which is that any amount of that happening on a grass turf field will necessarily be more effective than artificial turf. So to the question of mitigation, I'm also not aware of any research that suggests that there is any way of estimating the size or type of mitigation that you would need for directing runoff to remove contaminants, nutrients, etc. I think that space is at a premium in Arlington to begin with. So the idea that we're going to have artificial turf field directing into a wet meadow that is of sufficient size to mitigate all of the above, I think really is a non-starter. Like, the amount of land that you need to sufficiently mitigate these kind of impacts is going to outstrip the amount of land that you're going to have to install a field. So I think we're in a quandary there. And I want to touch on what others have, Natasha, Joe, Leslie, Jill, have mentioned so far about this being an anti-turf perspective. This isn't an ideological project with like a political bent that the subcommittee came in with. We looked at the evidence, we considered all of the impacts, and like Joe Barr explained earlier, there's really no way to make a positive determination fit in terms of environmental impacts. So when you question Turi's findings, they're looking at the same type of evidence that we're looking at. We were tasked with specifically considering environmental impacts. And Turi professionally does the same thing. So, you know, in those bracketed terms, I think the finding necessarily has to be a negative one. I've found no positive environmental effect of artificial turf fields to date.
And I will, without necessarily saying I agree with what you just said, David, I will say that, I mean, I think from the environmental perspective, and maybe Joe said this, Joe Connolly said this, I mean, it may be harder to be more neutral on that one. And then, by the way, I don't want to say the other groups tried to be neutral, but I think they sort of looked at, the studies, and on some things artificial turf comes out better, and on some things natural grass fields come out better. And so I don't want to impression to be that the environmental group didn't. I mean, I think probably the studies you looked at probably went in one direction more than the rest of our subject matter. I did have one question. If someone else wants to get in, I'll defer to them. But I did have one question about wildlife, because we didn't really talk much about wildlife. And there was something in the environmental report that said, that the turf gets too hot for wildlife to walk across it, which may be the case. But I guess my question is, I mean, what evidence is there that wildlife would be walking across these fields on a really hot 95-degree day anyway? I mean, you usually don't see wildlife sitting out in the middle of the Dallin field or Magnolia field on a 95-degree sunny day, and 12 noon or 1 o'clock. So I guess I'm not saying that's not a valid point. Well, I'm not saying it's not an accurate point. I'm just saying I'm not sure it's a relevant point, because what evidence is there that wildlife would be walking across a natural turf field on a 95-degree day in the dead of, August at, high noon?
I can take that one, Jim, if you want me
Yeah,
to.
go right ahead. And by the way, I'm not saying this in a sort of critical way, more of a genuinely questioning way.
Yeah, for sure. So you're right, we don't tend to see the big fauna, so to speak. Like, we're not looking at deer or even foxes or coyotes that we know that we have around here in that kind of setting. But there are other forms of wildlife, certainly birds, insects. We're talking about microorganisms, things that live in the soil, etc., that would be essentially displaced by the installation of artificial turf. And that means, like the robins, the squirrels, the things that we do see a lot of wouldn't be found there on a hot day. I mean, quite frankly, I think most days they wouldn't be there, because the amount of biodiversity that's currently there, however minimal, is supporting them. And if we take that away, they're not going to be coming around anymore. So, of course, my role as environmental planner is to ensure that Arlington's ecologies are healthy and functioning. So that includes, the urban ecology of which we are a part, and spaces like recreational fields that support wildlife in, I think, numerous ways. They're not just for those bigger animals, but for the whole ecology. Does that answer your question, Jim?
It does. No, it's helpful. I think I was focused more on the heat part, but
Yeah,
you've given a bigger perspective that, I
did want to fit it in there in a different way. It just seemed like that was a hook to have that comment on, so it wound up in the heat section.
And I'd be remiss, by the way, if I didn't, I don't think I've said this yet. Welcome back, David, and congratulations.
Thank you.
We
Thank you.
missed you and we're glad to have you back. And boy, you're coming
Cheers.
right back into the heat of things. So, so to speak. Someone else want to jump in? I think someone was trying to when I took the
Well,
last question.
Yeah, I do want to jump in with the where do I jump in? Excuse me. It was relative to runoff. We and again, from a Park and Rec Commission perspective, we have heard from, and I will say, industry and those who design and build fields, that artificial turf fields can be built, can be designed and built to accommodate a large degree of runoff. If it is thought about at the design phase. For example, we chose not to pursue looking at Herd Field as an artificial turf field. The decision was made to go with a natural grass field. And that field is in a flood zone. Now, one of the conversations that we had prior or after we had, it was actually after we made the decision to go with natural grass, was with the engineering staff of the town that talked about how if our real focus in that area were to work at capturing the flooding and runoff that comes downstream from Millbrook and across the field, that chambers, I mean, there are more elegant solutions than natural grass fields. Putting chambers under the field in an artificial turf environment is a way that you can capture runoff. Now, obviously, we chose not to do it, but I bring it up just because I believe that to say that you can't do, I mean, the tone of the message from the environmental piece on artificial turf with respect to that topic was that there's nothing you can do. And I just don't see that as the only answer, when I think that there are potentially other things that could be looked at to mitigate the issue. You know, if the finding is that the carpet, and I think that there were conversations that we had that the carpets are also evolving. Perhaps the carpets that are there in general use now for artificial turf may be impermeable, but just like we've seen with the infills, that's just because that's the way it is today, doesn't mean it's not evolving to take care of the impact that has been recognized. And I guess that's what I'll say on that topic.
So you must hit a nerve, Leslie, because I saw.
I know, I see
the
a
whole group's
triple.
hands up. I'm
I hit a triple.
joking a little bit, but no. David, then Joe, then Mike. David?
I think fundamentally that's a misreading of that section, because as I remember it, I don't have it in front of me, but I remember the comment being that there are ways to mitigate runoff and that there is guidance suggested from DEP that they're redefining what they count as impermeable surface. So that's just a nod towards the regulatory environment that we're going likely to be in the near future, not a claim that it is necessarily impermeable or that there's no way of mitigating runoff or anything to that effect. And just to touch briefly on the question, the example of Herd Field, chambers underneath any field surfacing would be wonderful. And that's for sort of extreme flood conditions rather than direct runoff. So I think we're talking apples and oranges on that question. All right, that's it.
Joe?
So yeah, I guess I was just gonna say, because I did write parts of that section. I think my intent had been to sort of indicate that yes, like David sort of said, that there are ways to mitigate. You can manage stormwater in different ways, but fundamentally, and turf has gotten much better about draining water off the field, right? Like it used to be that when it rained on a turf field, it was swamped, and now there's great, in some cases better drainage than on a natural turf field in terms of the playing field being usable. But then that the question of permeability is that water going directly into the soil, particularly for like sort of standard rain events, like David was saying, not the 100-year flooding event, which is sort of not manageable regardless of the type of grass or whatever you have. So I think the idea is like as soon as you get into an engineered solution where you've got chambers and infiltration, ponds and whatever else we might need, and to David's point a minute ago, like we may not have room for that, and putting it underneath the field is going to get really expensive and be a maintenance nightmare. So I think it's a question of, does it actually infiltrate directly into the soil, or is it sort of some other stormwater management system, which implies a whole other series of things that have to happen that I think, again, the water may wind up not flooding, but it still doesn't, I don't think, consider to be a permeable system at that point, even if you do something else to manage it. Like I said, once you get an engineered solution, I think you've transitioned away from a truly permeable surface.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks. Leslie, I agree with you that things are changing. As I mentioned before about testing and chemical impacts and all of that, things are changing. And I think that the grass, the plastic components of artificial turf may be undergoing some change as well, the technologies that are coming along. And I think that would be great. What we have to deal with at the moment is what we know now. And as I said, we're talking about testing, we have to go with the current, most recent, most current regulatory framework that we're dealing with. So I think that, and as Joe said, there are probably lots of technical engineering solutions to some of these problems, but whether we can afford them or not is a whole different issue. But certainly worth investigating. That's why our report also mentions the issue of cost as a key component to deciding what kind of field to go for. So I've just raised that issue.
I'm open to having other folks weigh in, but I might want to shift the discussion a little bit at this point, now that we're sort of an hour into the meeting. But I don't want to cut anyone off if they want another comment.
Yes, Jim, just one thought, which is that my takeaway from the whole thing is like the answer is sort of it depends, and each project is probably has to be a case by case decision. Like I'm not sure. Again, this is my personal view, not the committee's view, is that like in the end, I'm not sure that we can give town meeting or the community like blanket recommendations of like do this or do that. It's more like here are the issues that need to be considered, and like in an individual project, like what are the very specific circumstances of what's possible, what's not possible, what's there now, what would be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not trying to short circuit the discussion, but I just want to throw that out as sort of like a question of whether we need to come to specific conclusions, or are we more sort of giving others kind of decision making thoughts. So anyway, that was my only other.
It's actually a great segue, Joe, to where I want to take the discussion next. Because I didn't read anything in any of the 3 working group submissions as being, maybe this is a glass half full approach. I didn't see anything inconsistent with where I believe, and it's just where I believe we probably are headed in terms of a final set of recommendations. I didn't see anything, there were different shades and different phrasings, but I didn't see anything that was radically inconsistent with the path I think we are on. But I guess that's the next topic, which is, Natasha and I have our work to do to kind of take what everyone's given us and try to make it work. And then you can tell us whether we succeeded or failed or how you want to make changes. But one thing we really, I think, need to discuss, and we don't have to spend forever tonight on it, but I'd like to at least spend the next, 20, 30 minutes, and that may be the remainder of the meeting, on, where are we going as a committee? Because I see the end of the report sort of being exactly what Joe said, okay, we've taken the deep dive. We've looked at a lot of studies. We've talked to a lot of people. We're not telling you to do anything or not do anything, but we're going to tell you some things that you should think about, and maybe some recommendations we'd say to the extent you do start having to make decisions about things. And I guess I'll get it rolling by saying, I guess I'll just put it out there. I haven't heard anyone in any of our meetings, granted, we never called the question on this, but I haven't heard anyone in any of our meetings or in anything explicitly in any of the narratives from the working groups come out and say that we should have a moratorium on turf in Arlington, or artificial turf in Arlington. Now, maybe I've misread the group, maybe I've misread the reports, but I have not heard anyone saying no turf ever, no how, no way, not even an option. Artificial turf. Is that correct? Because if someone does think that, I'd want to talk about it, but I haven't seen that in our conversations or in the submissions. Natasha, and then Joe.
You know what, Joe, you can go ahead.
Yeah, Jim, that's I mean, I understand everything that the environmental group is coming from. I am just afraid we're providing this report to town meeting, who ultimately can then take this information and then put together a citizens petition warrant article to potentially do a moratorium on fields. Just the way that the environmental, quite frankly, I think the environmental task force could have written that before we even started, because nothing's really changed. It's the same information that really we talked about the forum, and maybe the science is the science, so of course it was going to be the same. But I just would worry that without even talking about potential mitigation measures, and again, I'm not looking for people to be political or non-political. I forget what David said, but at least give some options that where turf may make sense to work, kind of like Joe Barr said,
Well, Joe, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think that's sort of where I'm trying to go with this. But I'm trying to sort of do the most extreme. Well, no, not the most extreme, but sort of one end of the spectrum where I'm saying I don't think I've seen anyone in this committee voice that view, which would then leave other views we can unpack more. But I don't want to say that nobody on this committee is for a moratorium if someone on this committee is actually for a moratorium.
But I'm saying, Jim, I'm saying is, again, I know it's probably going to be edited, but if you read that report as it is now, that's what it says to me without saying it. Actually, they did say it. They said it in
I
the
did
last.
not read it. I did not read it that way,
They
but
said it. They said it in the last paragraph. In the last
they never.
recommendation.
Well, I don't believe that is exactly what they said. Mike?
Quote.
Yeah, I think the
The word moratorium was never used.
No, it just said don't use it.
our
Well,
recommendation.
don't use it. Don't use it, or we recommend not using it is very different than you must never use. And we're saying you don't even have the option of thinking about it.
As Joe said, Joe Barr said earlier on, we were coming from strictly the environmental perspective, and the recommendation we made was that natural turf is the way to go. We also made it very clear that we think there needs to be a balance in the cost estimates, and with the latest environmental regulations and testing that we saw. I see where you're coming from, Joe. I understand that. And I think that, as Joe Barr said earlier, this is not going to end up, my assumption is that none of these reports are going to end up as they are now in the final. But that's why we came from the environmental perspective, looking at all those issues, and came up with that recommendation.
Leslie? And then Joe?
Yeah, I mean, that I guess the most vibrant reaction is, to that paragraph that says, therefore, based on our evaluation, the environmental subgroup recommends that new or reconstructed athletic fields should be constructed and maintained as organically managed natural grass rather than artificial turf fields. The word moratorium may not be used, but the message certainly came across the way Joe Conley interpreted it. I interpreted it the same way. And I would not support a report or a recommendation that is that definitive. It's not nuanced.
Although I think Joe Barr is going to jump in here. I think what Joe was saying to us tonight was perhaps that sentence was not reflective of their actual
But
sentiments.
that's what we read and are reacting to, I think is just what you're hearing from, it's what you're hearing from me. It is my reaction as I read through and got to the end. And I do think that Tanya and Jill pointed out earlier that the other two groups tried not to be so, I mean, it was not as black and white as what this particular paragraph says.
Joe?
I guess to say to that, like as Mike just said a minute ago, I think these are draft reports. We can edit them. We can make them, sort of say what the committee as a whole needs it to say based on whatever the outcome of this conversation is. So I don't think I hear Leslie and Jill and others what you're saying, and I can see how that's the impression that comes across. I don't think we intended that to be like, oh, and obviously this will be the recommendation of the entire group. But the one, Jim, to answer your question from a minute ago a different way, I guess what I would say is I don't think we should have a moratorium. And honestly, this whole committee process and hearing all the discussions has made me go from someone who was very, very skeptical of the need for artificial turf fields to like, oh, now I kind of understand more, like, even though there are negative environmental consequences, and if it was purely based on that, I would say don't do it. There are other things going on here in terms of playability and physical and mental health and other things. So like, I think I've actually come the other way of like, okay, now I am less likely to think that a moratorium would make a lot of sense, particularly because I would also argue that constraining the ability of town staff, of individual committees that have jurisdiction over certain things by just a sort of highly, not arbitrary, but like very, strict moratorium like we're better than that in a way as a town, right? Like we can make more subtle decisions based on discussions, and you know, one of the things I'm continually impressed about with all the committees I've ever been involved with or listened to in Arlington is just how we're lucky that we have knowledgeable people who live in town and are willing to serve on these committees. Like you all don't realize how lucky you are that the head of capital planning for the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is the vice chair of the capital planning committee, right? Like that's doesn't happen in every town, right? So we should trust in the people that we have appointed to these committees, because we have some really talented, knowledgeable people, including the folks on this committee.
David, you had your hand up at one point, but I'm not sure if you want to get in again. Maybe not.
I don't think
David?
it's necessarily a fruitful question, but were we not supposed to make recommendations?
You're saying were we not, or were?
Yeah, were the subcommittees all each not tasked with
I
making?
mean, you know, we left that rather open-ended. I mean, you know, you could.
I think what we did was we tried to structure it so that, you know, there was a lot of conversation in the beginning to ensure that there were mitigation strategies that were discussed, not just, you know, one way or another. It was really just trying to talk about like making sure that we're exploring all mitigation possibilities for all of the issues that we're sort of bringing up. And I think, you know, I've heard, you know, to your point too, David and Mike and Joe, I appreciate all of the work that you have done on this. And I think that, you know, there could be a situation where, you know, environmentally, maybe there are not mitigation strategies. And I think I think what is just a little bit surprising is that it really didn't seem like that's what the environmental group had been saying all along through this process. And so I think looking at the report and the way that Leslie interpreted that and Joe interpreted that, I sort of interpreted it the same way. I'm glad to hear that, you know, maybe that's not what the intent was. And I think that that's what's really awesome about our committee, is that we can sit here and have this conversation civilly, and that we're not in front of town meeting or in front of a forum fighting and screaming at each other. And so I think that this has been a really, really useful process. And I just, you know, I truly appreciate everyone's work that has been put into this. And I think that it might just be this is why we're having these conversations. And I'm so glad we didn't try to go ahead and just mesh together a report, because I think it's important that, you know, maybe what you're saying in the environmental report and the way that we're interpreting it is not what the intention sort of was. And that, I don't know. So this has been a helpful conversation for me to sort of understand where the environmental group is sort of coming from. And I do also realize, right, that the environmental piece, you're really looking at the environmental piece. You're not able to really look at maybe, you know, the health benefits. So I can talk about, you know, the importance of someone, you know, having access to playing fields and what that does for their mental health. In terms of the environmental, I wouldn't even know I don't know how to begin with that. So I want to just take a step back and say that perhaps maybe there aren't a lot of mitigation pieces. I guess I was just like, one thing that Joe Barr had mentioned and had talked a little bit about was just the MIT and how they had this filtration system and trying to keep the microplastics out of the Charles River. And I was really intrigued and thinking that like maybe that is a mitigation piece that is in play that we're going to learn more about. And so I guess that's at least where my perspective was coming from. And I just want to thank the environmental committee, because I don't want you to feel like this is like a bash session at all. It's more just like I really needed to try and understand where things were coming from. And I am so appreciative to everyone on this call in this group that we're able to work collaboratively like this. So I will end there my rant.
Leslie, but then I want to unpack some of this in the time we have. But Leslie, jump in.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Natasha, because I think that was some of what I was feeling and reacting to. And I know I will often have strong reactions, but I think that part of what we had discussed was trying to keep things local. And I'm not sure that, you know, we were, and that was early on when we were talking about how do we make this almost like a more personal look at this issue from a town of Arlington perspective? And are there ways to mitigate when we look at Arlington? And, you know, that was one of the reasons we brought in the athletic trainer for the high school who had a local perspective and could really talk to the injury, on the ground injuries, because all of the studies that we were looking at don't necessarily reflect our local environment. And I'm using that not to be environmental, but I think that maybe was a piece of looking at this from the environmental perspective that maybe needed a little more work, and looking at, as Joe says, are there areas that are less environmentally sensitive in the town that could support an artificial turf over natural grass? Or are there places where it absolutely should be natural grass? So I think I was just disappointed that I just didn't see the nuance that I had come to expect from our conversations. And I think that there's information also, you know, lessons from the Malden and the Brookline work that was done that I'm not sure that we have reflected in what we're looking at. And I also think there are perhaps, well, I'm not gonna, I know Jim is gonna go and talk about kind of next steps, which I'm sure I'll have my own ideas on, so I'll shut up now.
Jump in anytime, Leslie, and I mean that. So where I was trying to go with this was, you know, sort of, I'm trying to get the pulse of the median member of this committee, which may or may not be a wise maneuver on my part. And so I'm starting at sort of one end, and I'm trying to kind of figure out where the median is. And so that's why I do not get the sense that anyone on this committee, and I think by the commentary we just heard, it's confirmed, I do not get the sense that anyone on this committee would support a moratorium, basically saying that artificial turf should never be an option under any circumstances for the town of Arlington. No way, no how, never, can't even look at it. You know, essentially a you know, gag order, moratorium. You know, don't even talk about it, don't think about it. If I'm wrong, someone jump in. But that I'm going to start from that standpoint. So if nobody supports that idea, then the question is, for those who think artificial turf should be an option for the town of Arlington, maybe not the top option, but something that's on the menu of options, maybe not at the top of the menu, but somewhere in the discussion. What does that look like? Now, over the course of these meetings, I have not heard any member of this committee say one positive thing about crumb rubber infill. Maybe they've been keeping it quiet. And if you have, now's the time to tell us you love crumb rubber infill. But, you know, various types of infill is something I want to unpack a little bit. Because, you know, alternative infills are very untested, you know, I don't want to say very untested, but relatively untested, but somewhat promising. Crumb rubber infill has been very tested and is not terribly promising, for at least if you're putting in a field that you expect, you know, if you're thinking very long term, crumb rubber does not seem for a future project, and I want to emphasize for a future project, does not seem to be something where there's a great, you know, growth industry around crumb rubber, knowing what we know now. For ongoing projects or projects that have already committed, that's one thing, but you know, for a project that starts 2 or 3 years from now, I find it hard to believe someone would want to put in, you know, in a project, you know, that starts in 2026, 2027, who's going to want crumb rubber? But I guess, am I correct? Is there any appetite in this committee to say, if you ever did have a turf field, gosh darn it, it should have a crumb rubber infill in it, because that's the tried and true, infill.
I would say I walked in here kind of the opposite end of as Joe Barr and said, I don't see the evidence against the personal health piece of it. And I was really convinced by this committee that there are like reasonable alternatives. And I learned from the presenters we had that there are just more and more technology to come up with things that are better than crumb rubber. And so I think what I would, as a member of this committee, if we said we want to choose things other than crumb rubber, I would be very comfortable explaining that to someone I know in town and saying, here, here's how I evolved from a really useful discussion where we looked at the research, we had experts, crumb rubber is adding chemicals to our environment that impact our environment large and at the personal level. And even if there is no direct correlation between the chemical that came out of the crumb rubber and someone's personal health, if we have reasonable alternatives that are not cost prohibitive, why would we not go in that direction? And so I think that is, in my opinion, a real positive that came out of this committee, that like I didn't walk into this committee thinking that would be our end point. And I think it's important that our paper tells the story of that and how we got to that conclusion, so that as people who take over constructing a project are looking at new alternatives, they can really say, is it substantially better than crumb rubber, and where do we end up? Because I don't think we have enough data to say what alternative is the one that we should use.
Not at this moment in 2024. Yes, I agree with everything Jill just said. Mike?
Jim?
Yeah, that goes along with what I was saying before. We've all said before that things are evolving, both in terms of testing and in terms of technology and what's available in the market. And I think that comes back to what we said before, that deciding on a field is a site-specific issue that will change depending on where you are in town. And I think regarding, the issue of looking at things locally, that's the most local we can get. And I think that we'll just have to do each field as it comes along.
Natasha?
I just want to interject. I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. I believe there is a rec meeting tonight, and I think Mike has a hard stop at 6:30, so we're at the 6:20 mark.
Mm-hmm.
So unless someone is a huge crumb rubber fan for future projects, I'm going to move on to the next point.
Crumb rubber. I mean, crumb rubber is going to be used in town in future projects. And are we saying that?
Well, future projects or projects that have essentially already begun?
We have 2 crumb rubber fields in town. One that's being redone as a crumb rubber infill field.
Those are, yeah.
So
those are ongoing fields, but they also are fields that every 8 to 10 years have to evaluate what they want out of that next field.
And I think, so I think those were not put into the discussions before and really haven't been discussed. But I think I would just put out there that perhaps we should spend some time discussing them.
Yeah, I would agree.
Condition.
I would agree. The only thing I'd mention is that the testing done on the 2 fields was done, I think, in 2019. We're using standards back then, and there are new standards and testing and methods that we may want to consider, that we've learned a lot in the last few years about what's in crumb rubber and what its impacts might be.
So I just think it's almost a 2-pronged, Jim, on the crumb rubber. Projects that don't exist and projects and fields that do.
Who has this hard stop at 6:30? I just want to be okay. So here's what I propose. I'm going to put a stop to this discussion now to move to the next item, which is sort of about timing. And then you'll see how it all wraps together. So initially I was gonna, and Natasha and I were gonna say we shouldn't have a meeting next week because she and I we thought we could get a draft to everyone by this Friday. We can't. By next Friday, I think we can. And so we were going to say we should skip our meeting next week. I now actually think we should have a meeting next week, not where we will review a draft report, but where we will continue this discussion about potential findings and recommendations, because I think we've started to unpack it, and I think it's a very productive discussion. I don't want to rush the discussion about any of these things. I mean, I'll just tell you on my list, I have things like from rubber, PFAS, free certifications, heat guidelines, age guidelines, recycling, irrigation, testing, various points that if you are talking about having this as somewhere on the menu of options, in Arlington, these are all factors I think that we saw in Brookline, and we saw other places where they put in various qualifiers or caveats or provisos. Choose your word, I guess. So I think, if nothing else, having our next meeting just to flesh all that out is worthwhile, even if we don't have a draft report to read yet. But I also want to point out that obviously a week from Friday is March 22nd, which is technically under the Warren article that passed last spring, the deadline for us to submit our report. Now the report said 30 days before the start of town meeting. I don't want to offend Susan Stampson-Skull, who's a good friend. I kind of think the 30 days was a little bit of a arbitrary deadline. I think the idea was that it would be before the start of town meeting, so that we could present this in a committee report to town meeting at the next annual town meeting. But it's obviously after the warrant closed, so there's nothing we say or do that's going to inform a warrant article for this town meeting, whether it's 30 days before town meeting or 3 days before town meeting. I think we are currently on track to finish this report, to wrap the whole thing up. And that's factoring in time for this committee to take a very close look at a draft and revise and make recommendations, and for the public to have a public, not necessarily a public hearing, but a public input meeting where the public can weigh in on a draft. I think there's time for both of those things, and that this report could still be done before town meeting. In fact, I'm very confident of that. At some point, in the second or third week of April, which would be before the start of town meeting, which I believe is on April 22nd or 3rd this year. Technically, we would go past our deadline, but in a way that I think has de minimis harm and is really not a big issue. We do have a warrant article that Susan Stamps has submitted. I believe it's Article 19 for the town meeting to extend our charge to the fall, I think October or November. I don't think we need that much time. I think the plane is, circling the airport and getting ready to land. We're not there yet, but I think we're fairly close. And I don't think, 4 or 5 more months is going to change where we are. That might change, but I don't think so. So that's my long way of saying that Natasha and I have drafted a letter to the select board that I would like to send to the select board and the town moderator, informing them of where we are and informing them that, this is the work we've done up to this point. This is our estimated timeline for wrapping it up. And we're just sort of letting you know now, we will not hand this in by March 22nd, but we expect to hand it in before the start of town meeting this year. We have taken, without anything formal, we've taken the temperature of officials in town, and they seem open to that approach. You never say never until you actually submit the letter, but there seems openness and receptivity to that approach. So is anyone here uncomfortable with that?
No.
Because if they were, I'd consider holding back on that letter. But if everyone is fine with it, Natasha and I will submit that letter this week.
Jim,
And then I think the plan is we meet next week. We keep up this really good discussion. And then by the end of next week, if all goes well, knock on wood, Natasha and I have a draft to share with you, which may or may not include these other, the end piece. Maybe it will have it, maybe it won't, depending on how our discussion goes next week. But at least you'll start to get a sense of how we're pulling this all together, and you can tell us if we did a good job at it or if we totally missed the mark. Natasha, anything else?
No, I think that's great. And, any additional information that comes our way, we will continue to put into the packets up until, our meeting here, our charge is finalized. So.
And thanks to Jim and Natasha for your leadership and help here. This is great. I gotta run.
Hi,
Hi,
Mike.
Mike, thanks.
Joe, you had a comment?
just typically there's like a deadline for getting reports copied for town meeting, even if they're going to be put in the back of the room. So and not every report has hard copies, although I feel like this is one that perhaps should, given how controversial it is. So I just don't know I forget what those dates are, but we don't have until April 23rd to finish it.
Yeah, no, my goal is to be well before the 23rd. Some point hopefully before April 12th would be my goal, but I don't want to lock us into any date. I'm sort of saying to the select board and town moderator, second or third week of April, but certainly before the start of town meeting. And some of it's also just formatting. I mean, there's mundane things that are still important, and this is my fault, I didn't recommend a common way of doing footnotes or endnotes or citations. So, we've got to kind of just make that uniform throughout, and that takes time. And the way we kind of, each section should kind of, even though people follow different formats, we're not changing the content, but we're trying to stylistically make sure that it all kind of follows the same way and doesn't abruptly change course just because you move to the environmental topic or the safety topic. I will reiterate that if you have a list of sources you use, whether you cited them or not is irrelevant. If you at any point along the way read an article, whether you cited it or not, send it to Natasha, because we need to be writing that appendix, sort of a bibliography, I guess, or list of references. We need to have that done because we don't want to be rushing that at the last minute. Anything else, Marvin? You've been quiet this meeting, which I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign.
No. It's a good sign. I've just, I've been appreciating the conversation. It's fine.
Great.
Thank
you.
And I think, as you said, I think, we're quite close to the end, which I think is, which is great. I mean, I don't, I certainly don't want to, kind of put any expectations on you and Natasha, but I don't see any problem with this getting done well before town meeting starts. So, and if you need another hand, let me know. I'll jump in. So, well,
I appreciate the vote of confidence, Marvin. If you said nothing else this meeting, that makes me feel great. So, final comments before we break for the night? I guess I'll make one, which is I just really appreciate this committee. And this was probably our toughest meeting because it's the first time we had to really actually challenge each other a little bit about, as opposed to just raising issues, actually, defend our positions or explain our positions. And I appreciate the civil tone and the, very good questions and the nice back and forth tonight. So I hope we can continue that next week. And I really just appreciate this committee. It's one of the better ones I've worked on in town. So it's a credit to all of you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Yeah, and I'll
Right.
second it with a question. Our next meeting is next Tuesday, the 19th, and not until then.
Yes.
We had a whole series of dates kind of
Yeah.
penciled
Well,
in.
yeah, there was at one point a bunch of dates I threw
Exactly.
out,
So I just wanted
when
to
I
make
thought
sure
we were
that
headed towards the 20th. Yeah, you could ignore
the
anything
19th,
that was
next Tuesday, the 19th.
aspirational in January and February. Yeah.
Right.
All right, I'll go
I
right down
have
the list.
seconded Natasha's motion to adjourn.
Thank
Awesome.
you, Leslie.
So we'll go down the list. Mike, I know, had to jump off. So we will go, I'm just gonna go completely out of order here. Mike, Joe Barr,
Yep.
Leslie,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Marvin,
Yes.
Jill,
Yes.
Natasha, yes. And I believe that is everybody that is here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. And yep. So that's the 7 of us. So it's a 6 to 6-0, 1 absent. So see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a great night.
Night.
Bye.
ACMi productions are only made possible with your support. Visit patreon.com/ACMi to learn how you can help.